Thank you so much for making me welcome. It is just a huge pleasure to be back at St Mark's in person this time and not just on Zoom. It's a real pleasure to see so many familiar faces and to meet many new ones. As you undoubtedly know if you listen to the podcast each week that your clergy make about the readings that come up, the clergy who are going to preach always look, a week or two in advance to see what's coming up and mull on it a little, do a bit of study as necessary, knowing that the point of the sermon is to unfold something of the meaning of the scriptures and with special attention to the gospel. Now, I don't know what it is about every time I return to Connecticut, where I lived for nearly a decade. I love Connecticut, especially in the fall. But every time I come back here, it seems that I get the gospel that is difficult to preach on. I was here 1 month ago preaching at Justin Crisp's church. I know many of you know him. And that week it was all about Jesus and divorce. So great, I thought, well, I can do that, a bit of study and a bit of thought, and sure enough, it was okay. And then I come here and it's about wars and rumors of wars and the end of the world. Well, at one level, this might not make the preacher rejoice, and yet, on the other hand, as I read this through, I thought, this is strangely apt right now. There are wars going on around the world, frightening wars, and rumours of possibilities that make us feel anxious, uncomfortable, worried. And right here in the States, I don't know about you, but my stateside home is in Rhode Island, and it's our experience that families are really, almost at war with each other after the election season, that there's so much strife and anxiety as people struggle to agree on who we are as a nation. And now, this week, we've watched the fallout in the Anglican Communion as the most terrible revelations, heartbreaking stories of abuse have put the church, especially in England, but with effect worldwide, in quite a spin as we try and work out how to make things right. Well, whether it's a personal thing, a political thing, or a global thing, one way or another, most of us, I think, do find ourselves in times of uncertainty right now, watching, waiting to see how things will pan out, hoping, praying, God, when are you going to make things better? And that's roughly what the disciples were saying to Jesus in the gospel. Jesus, when is it going to get better? You keep promising us these marvelous things. When is it going to happen? And then he turns around and says, well, first you're going to hear of wars and rumors of wars, and don't be alarmed. And I'm like, hang on, Jesus, don't be alarmed? Of course I'm alarmed. We both know that things are already not looking good, and now you're ramping it up and talking about the end of the world? What do you mean, don't be alarmed? So I go back to it and I read again. What is Jesus really saying here? What I want to read is, don't worry, it's going to get better like tomorrow morning. But when he mentions the end of the world, I don't think that he's actually just going all apocalyptic on us. It seems to me that what he's saying is, yes, I know there are conflicts. I know that there is strife and division. I know things have gone horribly wrong in a number of places and all of this shocking stuff. But, Jesus says, however bad it is, and it is bad, this is still just the world as we know it. And it's actually not that different from the cycles that we've been through over and over again through history. The world is a difficult place. It is. But it's not the end of the world yet. The famous biblical scholar Morna Hooker put it like this. She said what Jesus was saying was, don't get too excited. The end of the world is near, but it's not as near as all that. Or, if you like the gospel according to the movies, there is a line that puts it beautifully, wittily. If you've ever seen the movie The Best Exotic Marigold Hotel, there's a marvelous character there called Sonny. And he pretty much encapsulates what Jesus says in this line. Everything will be all right in the end. So, if it's not all right, it's not the end yet. Now, I know that's the movies, but that is not a bad approximation of what Jesus was saying. On this weekend's women's retreat, I had a marvellous time. I hope everybody else did too, but What a great group. We had just a splendid time, and we have been thinking about how to have hope when things look a bit hopeless, and how faith and hope are not just irrational optimism, but faith is the ability to look reality straight in the face and still know that God is with us, even in the bad times. And so we turn to Hannah, whose story we read in the book of 1 Samuel. I love Hannah partly because she was a songwriter, and I find that personally inspiring, but the little section of her story that we read, we find that this was a woman whose experience was that everything was really not all right. She'd experienced personal sorrow. She longed and longed for a baby that never came. And she also suffered some abuse and mistreatment because her nearest female friend, who should have been her ally, bullied her, mocked her, and gave her a terrible time. And then her husband, who really did love her, did that thing which, well-meaning, sometimes we put our arms around people and say, your life isn't that bad, really. Yeah, I know you're feeling sad right now, but look at how great your life is, actually. If you're on the receiving end of that, sometimes it doesn't make it better. It makes it worse. If I'm feeling sad, I don't want to be told how great my life is. I need some comfort. And then to add insult to injury, she goes to the temple. Because if all else fails, well, at least you can pray to God, right? And then the priest, sitting on the steps, looks at her and says, "Away with you, drunken woman. What's all this rocking and wailing?" And just misses the point completely. It wasn't the end of the world, but it must have felt like the end of the world to Hannah. Her friends, her husband, her priest, and even her own body had all let her down. It's complicated too, because the backstory was that she lived in a time of political turmoil. There were wars and rumours of wars going on in the background for her. And sometimes you feel that you're not allowed to talk about your personal griefs if somebody else has it worse. First world problems thing. So here we have Hannah, who to the outside observer has not much to complain about, but on the inside is eaten up with grief. Her body, her friends, her husband, everybody's let her down, and she prays. But then, thank goodness, the priest kind of sees the light. Sometimes we need a moment. And the priest says to her, "Oh, okay, I get it now. God bless you. God has heard you. God has heard you." Theologians have struggled for centuries with that question, where is God when the bad stuff happens? C.S. Lewis put it very beautifully when he wrote about his own personal grief. And he said, when everything's going fine, you just walk along in the sunshine feeling like God is with you and all is well with the world. But something catastrophic, something desperate and heartbreaking happens, and all of a sudden you turn to God, and it's as if the door slams in your face, and then you hear the sound of the bolts, double bolting on the other side of the door. God seems to vanish. Why is God there when it's good and disappears when it's not? He does go on to answer his own question, but that's for another day. Jürgen Moltmann asked, where was God in the horrors of the Second World War? And he concluded that no, God had not just allowed this to happen. It wasn't God was looking the other way and something terrible just crept in. No, he says, writ large, in the crucifixion, you see that God was there suffering with those who suffered, present in the middle of it, not looking on from above, dispassionate, but there in the middle of it. And wind back a few centuries, and the 14th century mystic Julian of Norwich said something quite similar. She lived through a time of terrible international war, bloody, dreadful, and a civil rebellion, and a pandemic that was 10 times worse than COVID. And in the middle of all of that, she said, all manner of thing shall be well. All shall be well. It's not well now, but God is with us now, and ultimately it will be made whole. Well, you might say, thanks very much, but it doesn't help me very much right now. But just turn back to Hannah one more time. I look at her weeping in despair before God on the temple steps. And then I look at the priest who says to her, Hannah, God has heard you. God has heard you. And then we read that she goes home. Now, when we read the whole story, of course, you get to the end and you see that her prayers got answered, and sure enough, she did have a baby and her joy was made complete. But just before that final paragraph, before her prayers were answered, we see that she went home, and it says her countenance was not sad anymore. Her face was not, her depression lifted, her heart was light. She wasn't struggling upstream, she was as light as a feather. But her prayers had not yet been answered. The bad stuff was the same as it was before. And the thing that changed was not the tangible answer to prayer. The thing that changed was she knew she'd been seen. She'd been heard. And she had the assurance that God was with her. And that alone, even before her prayers were answered, was enough to sustain her and to fill her heart with joy. So yes, there was a happy ending subsequently, but I think for us, in the middle of things that are difficult, we need to know that we don't have to wait until things get better to be assured that God is with us. What we need is to know right now, today, in New Canaan, this Sunday morning, God sees you, God hears you, and God is with you. Amen.